We have big news about the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered almost 80 years ago. How could there be news about them? Well, there is news. Stay tuned and you'll find out what it is and why it's important. In a recent video, I talked about 5 reasons to believe the Bible, and one of the things I mentioned was the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in a cave near the Dead Sea in Israel in 1947 by a Bedouin boy looking for some lost goats. A few days ago, there was news about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which buttresses my point about the reliability of the Bible. But first, we need to go back to contrast then and now. For a long time, from the late 19th century and early 20th century, skeptics said the Bible couldn't be trusted because the copies of the Bible that were available were from many years after they were written, and the oldest Bibles available were copies of copies of copies. So the reasoning went, the Bible is not a reliable record of the events it describes. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 changed that because they were 1,000 years older than any biblical manuscripts that had been discovered before, and there was very little difference in the Dead Sea manuscripts and the Hebrew Bible that we have now. 38 of the 39 Old Testament books were represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it forced a change in the way people talked about these Old Testament books. The big news is that scholars have begun to use AI to help date the scrolls, and some of the Dead Sea Scrolls can now be date adjusted as much as 100 years earlier than previously thought. I'll get to why that's important in a minute. Radiocarbon 14 dating was used to date the scrolls originally, and they were said to date as far back as the middle of the 2nd century BCE, or about 150 years BC. A drawback of carbon-14 dating is that you must actually destroy a bit of the manuscript in testing it. Of course, all dating is a range of years because no documents from ancient times have dates, at least not with the calendar we use today, so dating is always a challenge. Date ranges had been assigned to the scrolls after carbon-14 dating and other methods like paleography, that is, handwriting analysis. But recently, scholars realized that their dating could be wrong because of a very unfortunate practice by the scholars in the 1950s. They applied castor oil to these priceless manuscripts to make the writing more readable, and it worked to make them easier to read. But only recently did someone figure out that the castor oil skewed the carbon-14 dating results, making the documents appear much more recent than they actually were. So now scholars have been using an artificial intelligence, or AI, called Enoch. Researchers at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands created Enoch. They trained it on 24 manuscripts, of which scholars were reasonably certain of the date. The manuscripts they used were mostly from among the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they also used some manuscripts from other sources. They took high-resolution images of these manuscripts, which were manipulated to make the writing more distinct and minimize confusing the model with imperfections in the material the manuscript was written on. They then used Enoch to analyze the handwriting on 135 Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts to analyze the writing style to arrive at a date for each manuscript. To understand why this is important, you only have to look at a copy of the Declaration of Independence or another document from 250 or more years ago and compare it to handwritten documents today. It's obvious that handwriting practice over time and analysis of handwriting style can be helpful in dating manuscripts. In many cases, there was little difference between what the date for a given manuscript had been thought to be and what Enoch said it should be. But there were a few that were very different. Here's a chart of the date ranges and the differences between the dates that had been accepted and the new date ranges arrived at with the help of AI. Left is earlier, right is later. The blue date ranges are those arrived at by radiocarbon dating. The pink represents the dates assigned by paleographers. Note that most of them are much later in the timeline, so the human scholar bias is toward late dating. The lime green is the date ranges assigned by Enoch. There's a lot of overlap, but in a few important cases, AI gave the documents much earlier dates. One of the scrolls that was different is a fragment of the book of Daniel, chapters 8 through 11. According to the historical sections of Daniel, the prophet, whose name the book bears, lived about 600 BC and spent most of his life in captivity in Babylon and much later Persia, modern Iran. Daniel is an interesting case because it has long been thought by liberal scholars to have been written very late, because it contains miracle stories and prophecies that name the Grecian Empire following the Medo-Persian Empire, which in turn was followed by a terrible empire of iron, which has often been interpreted to be Rome. Because of these predictions, skeptics declared that Daniel had to be written very late because the Daniel who lived 600 years BC could not possibly prophesy about future empires. So liberal scholars says Daniel's book was not written by the prophet of the exile whose story the book tells, but by someone else who used his name around 100 BC. Of course, Bible prophecies about the future are not a problem for believers who believe in a God that knows the end from the beginning and is able to share whatever information he deems important with his servants. But new AI-assisted research shows that the copy of Daniel from the Dead Sea Scrolls is maybe as much as 100 years older than originally thought, maybe even going back to the time the liberal scholars believe the author is supposed to have lived. They now believe the document is as old as about 230 BC. That's significant because it's only 100 years after Alexander the Great of Greece defeated Persia and about 100 years before Rome became ascendant over Greece. So if the book does predict the rise of Rome, that is significant and raises the question, if it was written as early as the 3rd century BC, how did the author know about a terrible empire that would follow Greece? Now, some have said that Daniel does not predict the rise of Rome at all, but the terrible beast of Daniel 7 is Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek ruler who persecuted the Jews during the Maccabean period. It's true that the book of Daniel has very detailed information about that period, especially in chapter 12, but the Maccabean revolt began in 167 BC, so if this manuscript of Daniel is dated to 230 BC, it even predates the Maccabean revolt. So even if you say Daniel doesn't predict the rise of Rome, it still predicts the future Antiochus persecution and Maccabean revolt. In the description of the video, I'm going to include links to several articles on this subject so you can read the information for yourself, including the original scientific paper, which of course is not nearly as exciting as the news reports, but I've included both in the description. Another document which is redated earlier is the scroll of Ecclesiastes. Traditionally, the book of Ecclesiastes has been thought to have been written by King Solomon about 950 BC, but the Dead Sea Scrolls scholars previously dated this manuscript to 50 BC. But after analysis by Enoch, it appears the date of Ecclesiastes should be about 150 BC, give or take a full century earlier. That's about when liberal scholars believe the book was written. Remember, with these dates, we aren't talking about when the original author wrote the books, but when these copies that are among the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. These date revisions have important implications because scholars are now dating some of these documents to during the lifetimes of the authors, at least when they believe the authors lived. That means they can no longer claim we don't know whether the text of the Bible is reliable if we have copies written during the author's lifetimes. Of course, Conservatives believe King Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes and that he lived about 950 BC. I'm sure there will be plenty of criticism about the use of AI to determine the age of these important documents. The small number of documents on which the Enoch AI was trained is a vulnerability the researchers acknowledge, but they wanted to keep the source documents to the type of documents in question. Like all uses of AI, this is as bad as it's going to be. It will only get better. And the uses for it go far beyond just the Dead Sea Scrolls. It isn't the last word, but it's exciting to think what could lie ahead for this new method of research. Is this conclusive proof of the inspiration of the Bible? No, not for people who don't want to believe, but it represents one more step forward toward science confirming the Bible. For centuries, the oldest copies of the Bible were from 1,000 years ago. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and suddenly the oldest copies were 2,000 years old, 1,000 years closer to the original documents. Now, the latest technology and scholarship has pushed that time back again by as much as 100 years closer to the time of the original documents were written. How many times will these dates be pushed back closer to when they were written as more documents are found and methods improve? I often say that the conventional wisdom has been that new discoveries by science would erode faith in the Bible and Christianity, but the fact is, scientific disciplines like archaeology, paleontology, and paleography, and now artificial intelligence, are all making it easier for believers to believe. I'm actually writing a nonfiction book titled Collision or Convergence about the sometimes contentious dialogue between science and faith. I've put together a sample of the content in an eBook you can get for free. I'll leave a link in the description. Also, if you have watched my other videos, you know that I'm also writing a series of novels called Age of the Kingdom, about Israel's united monarchy under King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. 3 novels are available so far. You can get $5 off any purchase of the first 2 novels through June 30. There's a link in the description for that as well. That's all for now. If you like this content, like this video and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.